Hello, and welcome to Hard Compound, an American take on F1. No race this weekend. We're still basking in the glow that was the Hungary race and the crazy win by Ocon. And we're still 2 weeks away from the next race in Belgium, lovely Belgium. But we have a content-rich episode for you. But first, son, what are you drinking?
Today I have Taco Truck Lager by Dust Bowl Brewing. I think it's based in Turlock, California.
Nice.
It's a nice, light, refreshing beer that I would definitely recommend if you're picking up a street taco. Definitely a good beer to go with.
Well, here in the Motor City, street tacos are hard to come by. Not hard to come by the High Life. That's what I'm drinking. A 40 ouncer. Haven't had one of these in many a year. That's acceptable. It's acceptable, and there's a lot of it. So, which I think should be the new slogan on our money here. So, before we get into the details of this episode, I'm still thinking about Hungary, about Ocon's first win, that crazy win, but even more, just that Alonso drive. That was just a drive for the ages. I was watching the onboard when it started, and he had to weave through all that traffic. It seemed like Stroll and Bottas wanted to take everyone out. I'm not sure how. I'm not sure how Alonso made it through there, but he did. And then 10 plus laps of holding off Hamilton in that Mercedes, which I think everyone now admits that's the only reason why Ocon won, was because what his teammate did. So what do you think of that? That's just a tough one to forget. I mean, it was just so amazing.
Definitely his vintage Fernando Alonso. He had an acceptable start, but then going into that first corner with all the carnage that was there and being able to find his way through that unscathed pretty much like his teammate did, that's already pretty incredible. And then going through the race, he held off several overtakes and ended up after sort of the leader's pit, he ended up leading the race for a couple of laps, I think, which are his first laps led since he's been back in F1 this season. And then, just incredible defense. He's always kind of been known for making the car as wide as it possibly can be. And it's just a lot of fun to watch a battle between two incredible veteran drivers, world champions. It's fun to watch that, and then to see, it result in his teammates win. That's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, it was great. Ocon got the win. Renault got a win. It was Ocon's first win. That was, like I said, we're going to be, 10, 20 years from now. Hopefully there'll be more wins for Ocon. You never know, especially driving Renault. But, everyone will still remember the Alonso drive, weaving through the start, holding off Hamilton for 10 plus laps. I think that's what we're all going to remember. We all knew eventually Hamilton and that Mercedes was going to pass, but we thought it would happen in one lap, two, maybe three tops. And that he held them off over 10 laps is it's just stunning. That's just one of those things that we're all going to be watching and thinking about 10, 20 years from now. So no race this weekend, no race next weekend. We're sort of in the dead zone, not much news either. So I thought one of the things we could talk about was how all the drivers are performing. For the first half of the year, I've seen the fans have voted, and F1 has their officially licensed game out, which also has driver rankings. So I thought we should take a deep dive into that. First, let's look at the fan rankings. Do you have any thoughts on that? I have them here up on the screen, but I think in this case, the fans mostly got it right.
Yeah, as far as this season goes, I think the fans came to a pretty good consensus. I agree with their rankings more so than I do the F1 game. And if I'm honest, I don't know exactly how the fan rankings work. I'm pretty sure it's just kind of a pooled ranking, and then everything is averaged out over the course of the season. And I tend to agree with a lot of it. some things I think people are still generally pretty biased, but overall, I'm happy with sort of the top 10 that you get. I think they are probably my top 10 drivers this season. So,
Yeah, it's sort of like in Major League Baseball when the fans vote on the All-Stars, you'll get a lot of folks, maybe they shouldn't be voted in, but they're still popular with the fans. Maybe they're late in their career, maybe they're from a big city market. But I think overall, the fans have done well on the top 10 scale. When you start averaging out thousands and millions of votes, you sort of get these oddities. At number one, tied for number one is Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. I think they've both probably been the best drivers this year. 8.8 out of a 10 scale. I'm not sure how granular you can legitimately make these, but I think having those two drivers at the top, definitely the fans got that one right.
I think those two have easily been the best drivers this season based on their results, and just the way they've driven this season has been pretty incredible. So yeah, I definitely agree, those two at the top.
Yeah, then after them, it's not controversial, but I think you can argue that they might be a little high. George Russell at number three, 7.7 out of 10. And then Charles Leclerc, number four, 7.5. Right behind him is teammate Carlos Sainz at 7.4. I think those are close, but I think in general the fans got them right. But you can argue some of those. I think Leclerc sort of has his moments. Russell has his moments, but I think overall you can make a solid case for those three.
For sure. Each of them, I think, has had a very acceptable season at worst and a pretty darn good season, in my opinion. I think George Russell, it's often hard to tell because of the car that he's in. The Williams is still, this last race in Hungary was the first points they've gotten in years. So, to sort of rate him separately from his car is kind of difficult to do. But I definitely think he's been a top 10, if not a top 5 driver this season. And putting him in at number 3 is maybe a little bit high, but, I'm not upset about it. And then the two Ferrari drivers, they've both been, I think, very good this season. Ferrari had such a dismal season last year. And this year, these two drivers in the Ferrari have been, I think, pushing that car to the limit every single race. And it's come to bite Leclerc in the butt a couple of times. But, overall, I think they've both been very good drivers this season and have sort of put Ferrari up where it should be.
Right. That Ferrari is doing much better, I think, than most of us thought it would. Charles is a bit of a hothead. Maybe it would be better if he was the Italian or the Spaniard, because he sometimes lets his emotions get, I think, overtake him, and he pushes the car where it can't go. But I think he's had a great season. I mean, he's proven himself ever since he entered F1. Also at number 5 is Pierre Gasly at 7.4. And then right after them, Fernando Alonso, and technically in 7th place at 7.3. And I think Alonso, I think after that Hungary drive, probably deserves higher, but he had a very slow start to the season. The first few races, Ocon was outperforming him, and then I think he sort of figured out that car, and now he's done better. I think if the vote were taken now, he'd probably be a little higher.
Yeah, he did have a slow start to the season, but has definitely gotten into the rhythm of that car a lot better than a guy like Ricardo or Perez has gotten into the rhythm of their car. So, he's been performing as well as Ocon has, if not, better, even though we saw Ocon win the race last week. I think, had the roles been reversed, Alonso could have done the same. So I think both Alpine drivers have been doing well. And obviously, I think from the fans' perspective, there's a little bit of nostalgia there. So we always kind of want Alonso to be doing well. And luckily, he's given us a good performance through half the season. And then just to mention Pierre Gasly, also tied with Carlos Sainz for the 5 spot. He in that AlphaTauri has been pretty much lights out since the last few races last season. So, I'm not surprised to see him in the top five here.
Yeah, yeah. And with Alonso, it's funny, I keep saying Renault, but they branded themselves Alpine. I think for a lot of us, we thought, being out of F1 for a couple of years, being 40, this is really more of a sort of a celebration of Alonso, sort of a ceremonial goodbye, his final season. But I think he said, no, this is not about any of that. I'm here to race, I'm here to win. And he's just done such a great job. Just behind Alonso, at 7.2 out of 10 is Lewis Hamilton. I think because Mercedes has had such a dominant car for so long, and so, it's just sort of obvious that Hamilton will win. I think people underestimate the effort it takes to consistently get everything out of that car, which he does. So I think just after Alonso at 7.2, eighth place, that's certainly deserved. And I think you could make the case he could even be a bit higher.
Yeah, Hamilton has been, again, an incredible driver this season. I think he doesn't necessarily have to work as hard to end up getting a win as another driver would, but to consistently perform at the top at sort of that car's limit definitely isn't going to be an easy task. And he has done that for, 7 years now. So he is, of course, deserving of a top 10 spot. And I'm with you, you could definitely make the case that he could be bumped up this list a little bit.
Yeah. And then rounding out the top 10 at 9, Seb Vettel at 7.1, just a hair under Hamilton. And then a bit distant from him at 6.7 is Ocon. Vettel's a bit tricky. He has his moments. That Aston car has just been, I think, not doing as well as we thought, given their trajectory over the last few years. But I think, as we saw when he got the second place before the disqualification last week, he's still there to drive. He's still there to race, to win. Certainly, I think he belongs in the top 10. And then Ocon, that Alpine car is sort of at the back of the mid pack, as we were to say. But he's, I think, doing as well as any other driver after that. I think I would put him in that 10 spot. I think he deserves it.
Agreed. Vettel, I think we were both really disappointed with him last season. Mm-hmm. And with Ferrari, he kind of knew he wasn't going to be with Ferrari any longer. And, we were wondering, is this the end of Vettel in F1? And, he gets this spot on Aston, and I think he's been a really solid driver this year. And I think a good compliment to Lance Stroll, actually. He has that veteran presence. He knows how to handle a car, and everybody loves Vettel. And, he's had a couple of podiums, minus the disqualification in the last race, but I think he is very deserving of being in the top 10 among all drivers this season, even though he hasn't necessarily got the points consistently to prove that. And then Ocon, I agree with you. He has been, you wouldn't necessarily consider him a top driver, but he is a consistent and hardworking driver. I think he always does the best that he can in that car and is pretty consistent in his fight with Alonso in F1 Great, which, I don't think you can say really a whole lot bad about Esteban Ocon.
Yeah. And, with Vettel, it's easy to dismiss Stroll because, his dad owns the team. And he had that horrible start last week where he took out Leclerc. But, he's only 22. Having Vettel on that team probably does so much good because he's not there to sort of dominate the garage, to make everything about him. He seems willing to share his knowledge, provide feedback. So I'm sure, in addition to, I just think, doing a much better job driving this year, that he's really going to prove invaluable. I think that was a real good acquisition. When Aston sort of jettisoned Perez last year and took on Vettel, I think there was a lot of hurt feelings, justifiably so. But I think the institutional knowledge, the racing knowledge that Vettel's willing to provide probably can't be underestimated.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree.
So, on that same line, FIA F1 came out with their new video game for this year, F1 2021. I know you've played it. But what I felt was interesting were how they sort of not just ranked the drivers, but they sort of tried to create this methodology for justifying the rankings. And I sort of wanted to dive into that, into what you thought about the methodology and the actual driver rankings. So, all the current drivers are ranked on 5 metrics: experience, which is obvious, how many races you've completed; what they call race craft, which is how many positions you've gained or lost in a race compared to an average; something they term awareness, which is what they're saying is the driver's ability to avoid incidents, penalties, and so forth. I think that's probably a bit of a loose number that they're inserting in there. Pace, which measures their best lap times and sort of calculates them to what they think is the mean for that lap. And then just sort of an overall weighted number based on those previous 4 factors. So I think when they first came out with the game, Williams was at the bottom. After last week's race, it's now Haas. But Williams, their 2 drivers, George Russell, an overall ranking of 84, Latifi at 71. But it just seems interesting to me. They both have similar experience. Russell is far ahead on racecraft, and that awareness number out of 100, they give George Russell 99 and Latifi 79. I'm just not sure their methodology is as solid as can be, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on the methodology, and then we can go through the rankings and find out what you think.
Sure. I think the methodology is a little bit ridiculous. Basically, experience in my mind, if you're including the other 3 metrics, as they call them, racecraft, awareness, and pace, I think experience has nothing to do with anything. So it doesn't really matter how many races you've driven. If you are faster, if you are better able to avoid incidents or penalties, if you are better at overtaking and defending than another driver who has way more experience than you, why would you get the same overall rating? That to me wouldn't make any sense, right? But
Yeah.
apparently that's how they're working it. So in my mind, that experience metric doesn't make any sense to me. I think they can do completely without it. But I think, most people would probably disagree with me.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, yeah, there's different tracks, different conditions. There might be crashes and so forth. So while I think experience matters, trying to attach a number to it that's anything beyond literally number of races they've been in
Mhm.
does seem a little suspect.
Yeah, I think that a lot of their values and metrics that they have sort of used for these drivers are without context. So they're trying to, say that drivers have so and so experience or are, this close to the fastest lap of a race without any context associated with that experience or with the car that they're in to get as close as they can to the fastest lap, right? It's not necessarily contextualized very well. So I think some of the numbers end up being a little bit off in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Plus, whenever you're trying to do these methodologies where you want to put hard numbers up against sort of soft realities, you start gaming the system and you really can't stop it. It's sort of like in the US, we're a month away from college football. The recruiting services rank all the high school students going into college, and they'll look at some guy and say, oh, wow, he's 6'5" and 210 pounds, and he can run the 100-yard dash and whatever. We'll give him a 3-star. We think he deserves 3 stars. They're sort of putting a sort of a soft number on top of hard numbers. And then you sort of game it because you can't help yourself, because you say, oh, I think this young man is a 3-star out of 5. And then you hear that Alabama is recruiting him heavily and you think, oh, well, then maybe he's a 4-star. You sort of start gaming the numbers. But so let's sort of see though how close we think they got it right. So overall rating for George Russell, 84 out of 100, and for Latifi, 71 out of 100. That seems reasonably approximate, I think.
I mean, yeah, it's a little bit hard to tell, but I think as much as we kind of see Russell beating his teammate in every qualifying session and then in most races, I think Latifi is a lot closer to George Russell than this would suggest. Or at the very least, I don't know that George Russell is just so far out competing Latifi as this would suggest. But that's kind of my opinion.
Right. Well, and then for Haas, for example, they have Mick Schumacher at 76 and the hapless Nikita Mazepin down at 67. And that might be true. I think Schumacher has already proven he's a better driver than Mazepin. I think. I don't think many would argue with that. But they've already elevated Schumacher at 76 over Latifi at just 71. I don't see any justification for that. Maybe in the next season or two, you could prove me wrong. But in the current system, I don't see how you put Mick Schumacher at 76 and Latifi only at 71.
Right. Me neither. I mean, apparently they're saying that Schumacher is better by, I guess, like five overall points than Latifi, but Latifi's only better than Mazepin by 4 overall points, right? So it's like there's this weird disconnect, I think, that people are really down on Latifi. They don't think Latifi's very good at all. And naturally, the same can be said about Mazepin, but I think with better reason than you can say so about Latifi. And just looking at all these other metrics too, they're fairly similar between Schumacher and Latifi, except for pace, in which Schumacher is significantly higher than
Right.
Latifi. And I'm not entirely sure that on a flying lap, Schumacher is really all that much better than Latifi is.
Right. I think Latifi, he's consistently poor in qualifying, it seems. Not that Williams is going to do much ever, but maybe that's sort of where they got the number. And I'm a longtime fan. I want Mick Schumacher to do well. I wouldn't be surprised if he turns out to be a better driver than Latifi, but having him at 76 out of 100 versus 71 out of 100 for Latifi, I don't think you can justify that in F1 2021. So now let's go to the forgotten team, Alfa Romeo. Kimi Räikkönen, to no one's surprise, has an experience of 99. How that isn't 100, I don't understand. I think he's had the most races, the most laps. He's been in F1 for what seems like 20 years. At what point do you get 100? I don't know. Maybe they just sort of refuse to give anyone 100 for experience. But they have Räikkönen at 87 and Giovinazzi higher than Latifi and Schumacher at 79.
Yeah, I don't understand the 99 necessarily for experience. It's probably just because if you give him 100 and then he completes more races, then like how do you adjust the other people in comparison to him? So I don't know. It's a bit odd, but it's not surprising that he has the highest experience rating. And then to see his overall at 87, he's basically ends up being middle of the pack pretty much, which I don't know if at this point in his career, he's really a middle of the pack driver. I'm pretty sure he's pretty far down the order now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is for F1 2021. He's higher than Russell. I think at this point, in any circuit, under any conditions, in the same car, Russell will outdrive Raikkonen. Maybe not so 20 years ago, but I think so now. So I think this is where we're starting to see these numbers sort of skew the truth, I think, in a bit. I don't think you can say Raikkonen in 2021 gets an 87 overall and George Russell an 84.
Right. And I also don't think that Giovinazzi is as bad as this game is suggesting he is. He's the fourth worst driver on this in this game at 79 overall. I think that's far from the truth. He's in a crap car, but he consistently outperforms Raikkonen. And I think he is a significantly better driver than anybody is giving him credit for. So these two ratings for these two drivers, I really don't agree with at all.
Yeah. Well, in the next AlphaTauri, Gasly is 90, so he's ahead of Russell, well ahead of Russell. He's just ahead of Raikkonen. And then Yuki Tsunoda has 82, and which puts him ahead of Giovinazzi, Mazepin, Schumacher, and Latifi, and just under Russell. And I do not see how that is justified with his half season of racing results.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with Yuki because looking at his other metrics, right? If you compare them to other drivers or just look at them for this season, obviously he's got the lowest experience rating among any of the drivers on the grid, but he has a very high racecraft value, which again is based on the positions lost or gained in a race as compared to kind of the average. So they're saying he's actually does very well passing and defending, essentially. And quite frankly, I don't know that I've seen that from Yuki this season. He seems like I don't think I ever really see him get past or pass anybody when he's not overtaking somebody in the pits. It seems like he rarely kind of overtakes, at least on the circuit. And then moving along, we get to his awareness rating, which I think might be the lowest, but I think it definitely should be if it's not the lowest awareness rating. I mean, he has just been seems like oblivious the entire season. Like he is just doing insane stuff, crashing, spinning, whatever, the whole season. And then you get to his pace, and his pace is pretty good, which I tend to agree with. I think he does have pretty good pace overall in that AlphaTauri. But to see him kind of as close as he is to some of the other drivers, I don't know that I understand it. I think this season has been, everybody's excited about Yuki, and I want him to do well. But I think this season he has not proved that he is a reliable and kind of really exceptional driver in F1.
Yeah, I like Yuki. I'm with you. I think the fans like Yuki. Everyone hopes we have a driver from Asia in F1 for years to come. He's connected with Honda, which we hope reverses their decision somehow and decides to stay in F1 or return soon. But this year he has not looked great, and he certainly hasn't deserved this rating, I think, above so many others. I liken him to a college quarterback who's drafted by the NFL, made the starting quarterback, and then just looks so woeful that first season because everything is different, everything is faster, everything is bigger. And there's just not many quarterbacks, for example, who can make that transition immediately. Tom Brady didn't do it. Peyton Manning did it. In F1, Charles Leclerc, I think, did it. There's just not many who can sort of command that F1 car and be a presence on the grid in their first year, like say a Charles Leclerc. And Yuki, I wish him well if he stays, at AlphaTauri. I'm sure we'll see him improve, but giving him an 82 compared, say, for example, to Giovinazzi 79, I don't see how you can justify that. Speaking of Leclerc, I think they're pretty solid here with the Ferrari drivers. At 88 overall, Charles Leclerc, and just behind him at 87 is Carlos Sainz, which I'm sure is a great motivator for Sainz because he's probably saying, "What the hell? How can you even distinguish 1 out of 100?" But I think those are pretty solid. If I had to sort of assign a value out of 100 to Leclerc, I'd probably give him 88, and I'd probably give Sainz in the mid 80s. So what do you think? Do you think they got Ferrari right?
I think they got Ferrari mostly right. I think both of these drivers are very talented young drivers, and I think it's very possible that both of them could have kind of an increased rating. Again, I don't know exactly where they get the numbers for the metrics that they're using, aside from the experience metric. But I think, Leclerc is 2 points behind Gasly. He's lower than Vettel and Alonso and Ricardo and Bottas. And quite frankly, I don't think that's true at all. I think he's better than all of those drivers, at least in 2021. And I think the same can be said for Carlos Sainz. I think he has the same rating as Kimi Räikkönen in 2021, which frankly is
Right.
baffling. So, if Räikkönen gets an 87, Carlos Sainz should have like a 93 rating. It just, it's one of those things where, you look at them independently of every other driver and you're thinking, yeah, those are acceptable ratings. But then you put them against the other drivers and you're thinking, well, why are they so much lower than these other guys? So
Right, right. And with Sainz, they're suggesting these rankings are driver based, but this is his first year in that Ferrari. I think he's doing an exceptional job, whereas Leclerc's been there for several years. So I do think high 80s out of 100 is a solid ranking, but you're right. When you start comparing them, to Pierre Gasly, I think is a good driver, but he gets a 90, higher than both Sainz and Leclerc. And then Raikkonen at 87, basically the same. Yeah, some of these numbers just don't make sense. Then we get to Alpine. Alonso, 89 out of 100, which I think might make sense. And again, experience at 99. Obviously, the F1 2021 game will not give anyone 100. And then Ocon at 86. And again, I think you can start justifying these numbers on an overall level. 89 for Alonso, 86 for Ocon. But you sort of have to start messing around with the averages. So, for example, obviously Alonso has experience at 99, Ocon only at 60. So the only way for them to justify this is to dramatically increase Ocon's rankings in the other elements. Racecraft, he's much higher than Alonso. Awareness, he's much higher than Alonso, which I think is ridiculous. But again, high 80s for those two, I think is justified.
yeah, I agree. The overall rating seems acceptable to me for both of these drivers. I think, they could be as close as the two Ferrari drivers. They have performed this season pretty similarly and have both had really good seasons, I think. But yeah, like you said, the way that they like weight the four other metrics to then get the overall, it is a little bit odd because like naturally, the experience for some guys is going to be way higher than for others, and I think that weight has to be way lower than the other three metrics in order to kind of
Right.
get acceptable ratings. So yeah, you were mentioning how Ocon's racecraft is quite a bit higher than Alonso's, and that simply is not true.
Right. And
Alonso,
awareness too.
yeah, it's it's a little bit odd to see those kinds of numbers between those two drivers, because those two like categories for Alonso, I think would be like he would be at the top of the pack in those two
Yeah,
things, as we saw in the
agreed.
Hungary race. So it's a little bit weird to see that.
Yeah, agreed. Then we go to Aston Martin. While the team hasn't performed as well this year as I think many of us expected, the ratings for Vettel and Stroll are close. Vettel, they have at 89, and I think that might be deserved, and Stroll at 83. One of the issues I have with Vettel's rating is he's got an experience of 91. Now, admittedly, Raikkonen and Alonso have been in more races, and they have a 99. But I think at some point you need to say, look, this is the max experience you can get. I'm not sure there are any sort of gains from being in one more race for Sebastian Vettel. But 89, I think that's acceptable, but a little high. That's the same as Alonso, and I don't think he's done as well as Alonso, and just a bit higher than both Leclerc and Sainz. And I just am not sure you can justify that. And then with Stroll at 83, I don't think it's a surprise that he's ahead of Latifi, just ahead of Yuki, just ahead of Mazepin. But you now have him basically just 1 point below Russell. And again, I just don't think Stroll deserves that. So I think for both Aston drivers, they're a little bit high.
I think that Vettel's is a bit high based on his performance last season, and then in the first half of this season, we've seen him, kind of rebound a bit. But I think, he hasn't been, I don't think, equal to Alonso or equal to Gasly this season. I don't think he's been better than Leclerc or Sainz necessarily. And so to kind of have that overall rating, again, it's sort of, when you look at them independently of all the other drivers, they kind of make sense. But then when you look at everybody else, you're thinking, Vettel, even though he's having a better year this year than he did last, he probably should be a little bit lower compared to the other drivers. And then with Stroll, I think Stroll is a pretty solid driver. He obviously doesn't have the same kind of experience as, several of the other drivers on the grid do, but his racecraft number is pretty high. It's one of the highest here. And I agree with that. I think he actually does do a very good job of overtaking guys throughout a race. His awareness, I think, is probably about where it should be. He tends to get himself in trouble, I think, so it's relatively low. And then his pace is actually quite low, which I don't know that I agree with that. I think he has significantly better pace than they give him credit for here. So overall, I think his actual value could be higher, but that would then mean he'd be, Russell's equal or better. And, like you were saying, I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Yeah, I agree. I think Stroll, he's a young driver. His father owns the team, but I think he's proven himself as deserving, or at least as capable of being an F1 driver. But having him that high, putting him as essentially as the equivalent of Russell, for example, I don't really think you can justify that. Seb, I think you probably can justify having him just above Alonso, Leclerc, and Sainz, though that's still a tough case to make, I think. It's the next team, however, where I think they've really they've screwed the pooch, as they say. For McLaren, Lando Norris, who I think has been not the equal of Verstappen, but just below Verstappen as in driver of the year this year, they have him at 91. And then they have Daniel Ricciardo, who has just been hapless most of the year, at 90. And I just don't see how you can put Ricciardo ahead of Vettel, Alonso, Russell. I'm just not sure how they're getting these numbers, and especially in racecraft and awareness. So, what do you think of this? Lando at 91, Ricardo at 90.
Lando at 91 kind of makes sense to me. I think he's been one of the better drivers in the last 2 seasons as compared to, the rest of the grid. When you look down at Gasly's at a 90, I think Norris is right there just a bit ahead of him. Vettel and Alonso at 89. I think Norris has proven that he's been just a little bit better. And then, the two Ferrari drivers again down there. Norris has, McLaren's trying to compete with Ferrari for that kind of third position. And Norris has proven that he has been, of the four drivers in those cars, the best of the four. So I am pretty okay with his overall rating. And then when you look at Ricardo, he had a solid season last year with Renault, but then coming in this year with McLaren, he has been significantly underperforming, definitely by his standards and by pretty much everybody who expected him to be a lot better than he has been doing so far. And so, yeah, you said, looking at the racecraft and awareness numbers, Ricardo has one of the highest racecraft values on here, just below his teammate Norris and then Verstappen. Those are the only two drivers who have better numbers there. And quite frankly, I think Ricardo gets way, way, way too much credit for his ability to overtake and defend. I think he's consistently been average at best when it comes to
I agree
to that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I think Ricardo has proven himself a better than average driver. He's now been in F1 for a decade or so, but this is F1 2021, and giving him a 90, I think that's tough to justify. Putting him ahead of Vettel and Alonso, Russell, just 1 point behind Norris. I think that's a hard case to make. And you're right. I mean, his racecraft and awareness are higher than nearly everyone else we've looked at so far. And I don't see what EA Sports and F1 2021 are seeing. But now we get to Red Bull. And I think they got it right. Unlike with the McLaren drivers, I think they got it right with Red Bull. So we have Checo at 87. And so far, the highest at 95, Max Verstappen. What do you think of those?
Those are pretty reasonable, I think. Verstappen, of course, he is going to be, the best overall driver. I think everyone has kind of come to that conclusion that he's been the best driver on the grid probably for the last few seasons. And this year he finally is in a car that he can kind of actually compete with Mercedes. On the other hand, you have Perez, who last year had a very good season with Racing Point, now Aston. And everyone was really high on him, even though his entire career he's been mediocre. So it's kind of funny how one season can totally turn around your career when there's sort of these openings. And he got into this Red Bull and really, I think he started off the season pretty strong and has really shown that he's more of a mid-pack driver since then.
Yeah.
He just can't compete with the guys at the front, even in a car that should be able to compete. So, I'm not surprised by his overall value here. I think that some of the guys behind him are probably better drivers, looking at Sainz and Russell here. But, he's in that Red Bull, and I think overall these ratings for these two drivers are pretty solid.
Right. I think they're close. This is a game after all. Max at 95 out of 100. You would think that puts him up with among the great drivers of all time. Alonso at his peak, Hamilton at his peak, Schumacher at his peak. And maybe you can justify that. But obviously you want to give him as high a number as anyone else on the grid. And I think 95 is solid. Perez, I think at 87, that is still a bit too high to justify. I sort of agree with you that Perez, he's always been in sort of a middling car until this year, and he's sort of deserved it. You think of guys who were recently in F1 who are chomping to get back in, like Hulkenberg, Kvyat, Albon. I think all three of them would be at least as good as Perez. So that may be a poor decision on Red Bull and Christian Horner's part in bringing Perez into the fold, but it is what it is. And I think even at just 87, that might still be a little bit too high. Now we get to the top team in the constructors, as it seems every year, Mercedes leading here at the first half of the year. And we have Lewis Hamilton tied for first overall at 95 with Max Verstappen. And then what I think of is almost a joke at 92, Valtteri Bottas. So what do you think of those two?
This, I think, is where the game's ability to contextualize data is really failing them, because Bottas simply isn't the third best driver on the grid. He's at best the 10th or 11th or 12th best driver on the grid. So to have him be so close to Hamilton and Verstappen, ahead of Norris, Gasly, Vettel, Leclerc, all these guys, it is quite frankly, like you said, a joke.
Right. Yeah, he's ahead right now of Lando Norris. He's ahead of Sebastian Vettel. He's ahead of Alonso. He's ahead of Leclerc and Sainz. He's ahead of Gasly. And he's ahead of George Russell. And I'm not seeing how that can be justified on any of those ratings. There's just no way.
Yeah, Bottas has never ever been anything but a good driver. And that's not a bad thing. I don't want to bash Bottas, but for everyone to constantly be holding him up as this great driver of F1, I think is absurd. He has won, I think, a total of 9 races in a Mercedes in like 4.5 seasons, right? So, or 5 seasons maybe now. It's just ridiculous how much praise he has gotten for being an okay driver in the best car.
Yeah.
And they haven't taken the driver out of the car in the case of this game right now for the rating in Bottas's case. They're still suggesting that like he's in that car, basically, is what I'm seeing. The only reason he would ever be the third best driver on the grid is because he was in a Mercedes car.
Yeah, when you think of that car, the Mercedes car, Bottas has had that car for 4+ seasons now, 4.5 seasons. To only have won 9 races in that car is, it's just hard to fathom. That car has been the best car for the past 7-8 years. He's been there for over 4. To give him a 92, to put him ahead of Russell, Sainz, Leclerc, Vettel, Alonso, it just, there's no justification for that. I think you can justify Hamilton's 95. I think he's fallen off a bit, just like Vettel has, but I think you can justify putting him right at that top spot. I mean, for example, in awareness, they give Bottas a 99 and they give Hamilton an 89. I mean, that's an awareness is a measure of the driver's ability to avoid incidents and penalties. To give Bottas 99 against Hamilton's 89 is comical. That's sort of forcing the issue there. That's EA Sports is not wanting us to take them seriously if that's what they're doing. So,
right. I mean, just look at Bottas this season, or even in the last race. Like, he was completely unaware of what was going on at the start of the race in Hungary and destroyed 3 cars because of it. I mean,
right.
I don't know how you give somebody the highest overall awareness rating when he's so blatantly is unaware of what is happening around him. Like pretty consistently. I mean, you think back to Emilia Romagna earlier this year in Italy when he came together with Russell, because I think he had no idea Russell was even there. He made a defensive move after Russell was going around him already, put Russell on the grass, and they came together because of it. It's like the
Yeah.
guy doesn't know what's going on. I don't know how you give him the best rating there. So
Yeah, I agree, and I don't come here to bash Botas, even though I think he may have earned a bashing. He's a fine driver. I would put him in sort of the Chico Perez pack. Sort of a middling pack. He's a fine driver. I think with his experience and being such a good teammate, he'd be great in a team that sort of is looking to build. And he would be sort of the veteran driver sharing his experience. But yeah, 92, that's more egregious than giving Ricardo 90, I think. I just find no justification for it. But speaking of Bottas, we've now gone through every driver, every ranking. It ends with Bottas at 92. There's been no more new news regarding if Bottas is going to stay with Mercedes next year, or will Russell be with Mercedes next year, and Bottas swap places and go to Williams. I know who's it, Helmut Marko, who owns Red Bull, is saying he thinks the deal has already been done for a swap with Bottas going to Williams and Russell going to Mercedes. I'm still not convinced that's going to happen. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't believe that a swap will be made. I think that it would be just so awful if it did. I don't know of a better word to use. Just Mercedes, I don't think necessarily would want to do that. And I think Bottas, it's kind of like tossing Bottas aside. I think it's maybe not necessarily all that fair to him to just say, all right, we're going to bring the young kid in now, go to his seat and never get a point again. It's like, I don't think that's necessarily going to be what happens. I would bet more that Bottas would go and fill like Raikkonen's seat at Alfa Romeo or something like that. I think it would be weird if Russell and Bottas swapped seats.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that Mercedes will put Russell in the Mercedes. Bottas has been the perfect teammate for Hamilton. He makes sure he gets that car across in the number 2 spot year after year and ensuring that Hamilton gets the wins. And I know they want to reward him for that. If Mercedes makes this move, will he even acquiesce to going to Williams or another F1 team? I'm not sure. We see a lot of these guys going into the Indy series and doing reasonably well there. So we'll see. I'm not convinced Russell's going to Mercedes, and if he does, I'm not convinced Bottas will stay in F1. So no race next weekend. We're still 2 weeks away from Belgium. Speaking of Bottas, the only real news I think we've had is that Aston, Haas, Alpine, they've all said they're stopping development for the year. So I think some of the great races that we've had so far in the first half of the year, I'm a little concerned we may not keep up the pace because so many of the cars are really sort of ending development. But I do think we'll still see Red Bull nipping at the heels every week of Mercedes. Do you have any thoughts for Belgium in 2 weeks or the second half of the season?
I think you're probably right. Red Bull will probably be right there on Mercedes' tail through the rest of the season, especially if Verstappen can stop getting taken out on the first lap. And by no fault of his own, I guess. And I think because a lot of the mid-pack teams are kind of ending development, I think we're going to still get some good scraps in the middle of the field because they won't be all that much farther ahead of any of the others. So I'm hoping to continue to see guys like Alonso and Vettel and even Raikkonen and Ricardo battle throughout there. Haas, it's not that surprising that they've ended development and are looking to 2022. They obviously have a really, really poor car this season and are going to take all of the money that they can and spend it on development for 2022 rather than continue to basically pour money into a losing battle this season. And with so many, issues they've already had this season, I think money really does come into effect for that team. So I think switching focus to next year is probably a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I can understand it. Haas has no money. They're not going anywhere. Why they would stop development. I'm a little disappointed that Aston and Alpine are as well, especially after the Hungary race where Alpine did so well. But I do think we'll see some good battles with Red Bull and Mercedes. And then, as you said, like Ferrari, McLaren battling it out. That should be fun as well in the second half of the season. Do you have any crazy predictions?
I don't know if I have anything crazy for really the rest of break or even going into the second half of the season. I think since we kind of get all this news in silly season, one of the things I think we might see is a lot of driver changes in the next week. So I'm going to say, by the time Belgium rolls around, every seat will be filled for 2022.
Interesting, interesting. My crazy prediction is related to that. I mentioned before there were some solid former F1 drivers still chomping at the bit to get back in. I don't think it will happen. My crazy prediction is that Kvyat, Hulkenberg, and Albon will never again race in an F1 race. That is my crazy prediction.
That's kind of interesting.
Okay, well, I think that is it. This was a good discussion, son. It was good going through the fan rankings and the F1 2021 game rankings. It was a great way to get us through this summer break. And that is it. I want to thank everyone for listening to everybody's most beloved father and son F1 podcast. And we are lights out.
See ya.